A racist cop kicked a black woman inside a courtroom, without knowing she was his new boss. That one moment, soaked in arrogance and ignorance, set off a chain reaction that no one in that courtroom could have predicted. Not the judge, not the bailiffs, and definitely not the officer who thought he was untouchable. He thought he knew power. But power was about to change faces. It happened on a Monday. One of those tense courtroom mornings where you could feel the air buzzing with silent judgments and unspoken tensions. People in the audience whispered, attorneys flipped through their notes, and defendants avoided eye contact with anyone who looked like authority. That's when she walked in. Quiet. Composed. Dressed professionally. A clipboard in hand. No badge showing. No announcements made. Just presence. The kind that commands attention, even if no one dares to give it, especially when that presence is wrapped in black skin. She took a seat quietly near the front, simply observing. Nothing disruptive. Nothing out of line. Just watching. That was enough to spark something in him, the cop standing by the witness stand. Maybe it was her confidence. Maybe it was her refusal to shrink. Or maybe it was just that deep, insidious racism he'd learned to normalize all his life. His jaw tightened. He walked toward her with that same slow, entitled pace some officers have when they think the badge gives them the right to belittle. "You lost, sweetheart," he sneered, loud enough for nearby attendees to glance over. She didn't answer. Just looked him straight in the eye, steady and calm. That silence, that unapologetic presence, was more than his ego could handle. He stepped closer, now standing right in front of her seat. "I said, this area is restricted. Get your black ass back to the bench before I drag you there myself." She didn't move. She didn't need to. Her mere refusal to obey him shattered something in his facade. In one reckless motion, he raised his leg and kicked her chair forward, hard enough to make her stumble. The gasps in the courtroom were immediate. Papers rustled. A gavel slammed. But the damage had already been done. Not just to her body, or to her pride, but to the illusion of his control. Because this wasn't just another woman. She wasn't someone he could intimidate and erase. She had walked into that courtroom not to witness a trial, but to oversee an entire system. What he didn't know, and what everyone in that room was about to find out, was that she had been appointed just days earlier as the new head of civil justice reform for the state. Not only was she there to observe systemic misconduct in real time, she was there with full authority to do something about it. And now she had the perfect case study, him. But at that moment, the courtroom didn't know any of that. All they saw was a black woman being humiliated in a room that claimed to serve justice. All they heard was the echo of that chair scraping the floor, her breath catching in her chest, and his smugness dripping with superiority. And for the first time in her long, uphill career, she let herself feel it. The rage. The ache. The bone-deep tiredness of having to prove her worth in every room she walked into. She felt every pair of eyes not helping her. Every bystander who stayed silent. Every drop of shame that wasn't hers to carry, but still stained her anyway. And still, she didn't break. She stood up. Straightened her blazer. Looked him in the eye again and said with a calm that was louder than any scream, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." He laughed. Shrugged. "I've heard that one before." But he hadn't heard her say it. And he sure as hell didn't know what she was about to do next. That moment wasn't just about a kick. It was about centuries of disrespect boiled down into a single blow. It was about power, and who gets to use it. About dignity, and who gets to keep it. She hadn't come to that courtroom for war, but war had found her. And the most devastating part for him? She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to get revenge with her fists. She had the system in her hands now. And unlike him, she knew how to use it. By the time the truth came out, about who she really was, he wouldn't just lose his job. He would lose every illusion of safety he ever clung to. And the entire city would be watching. This isn't just a story about a cop who abused his power. It's about a woman who'd spent her life being underestimated, and the one moment that turned all of that around. It's about justice, served cold, calm, and undeniable. But what exactly did she do after that kick? And how did he go from humiliating her publicly, to being the one begging for mercy? You're not ready for what happened next. Stick around. Because this story, it flips the script in a way no one saw coming. To every black viewer watching this right now, we want you to know, you matter, your story matters, and your voice matters. Here on Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. We believe in justice, dignity, and powerful narratives that expose the truth and honor those who've been silenced for too long. This story is for you. Stay strong, stay proud, and now, enjoy the story. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like if this story speaks to your heart. Let's begin. Atlanta was just beginning to wake up, sunlight bleeding through the skyline like warm honey over bricks and glass. The streets buzzed softly with the early signs of life, mothers rushing their kids to school, street vendors unlocking carts, and buses huffing tiredly at each stop. But behind the surface of the city's southern charm, there was tension sewn deep into the rhythm of daily life. Tension that had been there long before cell phone videos and hashtags, tension that black residents like Keisha knew all too well. She had grown up on the southwest side of the city, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still made time to help Keisha with her homework at night. Her mother, Vanessa, was a quiet but powerful woman, the kind who could look you in the eyes and make you believe in yourself again, even after the world tried to convince you otherwise. And from the time Keisha was just a little girl, Vanessa had planted one truth deep inside her: you'll always have to work twice as hard to get half as far, but if you do, no one can take it from you. Keisha listened. Every word. She carried that truth like armor, wearing it through every class where she was the only black girl, every meeting where she was the youngest voice at the table, and every courtroom where her presence felt more like protest than professionalism. She wasn't angry by nature, but she was tired. Tired of being dismissed, tired of pretending not to notice the way white men in suits glanced at her as if she were a clerk instead of a strategist. Still, she climbed. Degree after degree. Night classes. Internships. Countless sacrifices. And by the time she was 36, she had become one of the sharpest legal minds in Georgia, especially when it came to civil rights and justice reform. Her reputation was built not just on how she spoke, but on how she listened. Victims trusted her. Communities rallied behind her. She never made promises she couldn't keep, and when she said she would fight for someone, she fought like her own life depended on it. That's what caught the governor's attention. In a quiet, almost rushed move due to mounting political pressure, the administration had offered Keisha the position of head of civil justice reform, a new, publicly praised but privately controversial department. She was tasked with monitoring, auditing, and reforming misconduct within law enforcement and the justice system. They hadn't announced her yet. They wanted to strategize the rollout, they said. But she didn't need an announcement. She had work to do. And she had waited long enough to be at the table where decisions were made. The day before the incident in the courtroom, Keisha had spent hours reading files, cases flagged for possible abuse of power, excessive force, racially charged incidents swept under the rug. One name kept popping up: Officer Matthew Croft. A 15-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, celebrated by his peers as a no-nonsense kind of guy, tough on crime, and known for getting things handled. But beneath that badge of honor was a trail of complaints, nearly all from black and Latino civilians, none of which had ever made it past internal review. Croft had a history. Not just of doing his job aggressively, but of doing it with a sneer, with words that lingered longer than the bruises he left behind. The kind of cop who saw his authority as permission to dominate. That morning, Keisha entered the Fulton County Courthouse as she always did, early, intentional, invisible if possible. She wore a navy suit, low heels, no jewelry. She didn't want distractions, not for the people who were watching her and not for the ones she was watching. Her badge was tucked into her bag. Her credentials, clipped to her folder. No pomp. No press. Just focus. She was there to observe, to get a sense of how these hearings were being conducted, to note any patterns, to see who was speaking and who wasn't. That's how reform starts, by seeing what people think no one sees. Croft noticed her almost immediately. He was stationed near the witness box, towering, arms folded, his expression locked in its usual mix of boredom and suspicion. She had seen his type 100 times before, the posture of ownership over a space that was meant for everyone, the way his eyes scanned for something to control. She didn't flinch. She took her seat and started writing, noting the demographics of the courtroom, the tone of the judge, the number of defendants in jumpsuits. It didn't take long before she felt the weight of his gaze. That look that asks, "Who do you think you are?" Croft's shift in body language was subtle but unmistakable. He walked toward her slowly, a slight smirk on his face, trying to mask hostility with authority. "Ma'am, this section is for legal personnel only," he said, tilting his head just enough to make the phrase sound more like a threat than an explanation. Keisha calmly looked up, met his eyes, and replied, "I'm with the department. I'm cleared to observe." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her tone was direct but respectful. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. Croft didn't like not being obeyed. Not by a black woman, and definitely not one who didn't flinch at his presence. "You need to move," he said, voice lower, sharp now, cutting through the soft murmurs of the room. "Or I'll have to remove you myself." Keisha blinked once. Slowly. She didn't move. Didn't speak. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was discipline. It was centuries of black women holding their tongues in rooms where justice was just a word on a wall. But Croft didn't see that. He saw a challenge. That's when it happened. With one deliberate motion, Croft raised his leg and kicked the bottom of her chair, hard enough that it screeched against the tile and lurched forward. The folder in Keisha's hands dropped. Her body jolted. A wave of gasps rippled across the courtroom. The judge pounded the gavel but didn't say her name. Security stirred but did not rush. It was a moment frozen in hierarchy. And Keisha inhaled. Deep. Steady. She picked up her folder, stood up slowly, and fixed her gaze on Croft. Her face didn't show rage. It didn't need to. Her silence screamed it for her. And yet, in that room full of people, no one came to her defense. That was the part that burned the most. Not the kick. Not the words. But the silence. The indifference. The practiced blindness of people who had seen it all before and decided it wasn't their problem. She had walked into that room to observe injustice, and instead, she became its center. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with precision. Because now it wasn't just about files and patterns. Now it was personal. Now she had a face. A moment. A proof no one could deny. Croft still didn't know who she was. Not even after she stepped out of the courtroom. Not when she filed the incident internally. Not even when she requested access to his service record and started connecting dots that had been left buried. He wouldn't know until it was too late. Until the spotlight was turned around and the badge he hid behind was no longer big enough to shield him. And Keisha, well, Keisha didn't need vengeance. She needed change. But sometimes, the road to change starts with a storm. And Croft had just lit the first match. The morning after the incident, Keisha sat in her office with the door locked and the blinds drawn, staring at a blank document on her laptop. Her coffee had gone cold, untouched. The ache in her lower back was a dull reminder of the moment that still replayed in her mind like a broken loop. Not because she hadn't endured worse, she had. But because this time, it happened in the very place where justice was supposed to live. In the room where law and order were meant to protect people like her. And the silence after the impact, that haunting silence, still rang louder than the gavel that eventually followed. She hadn't cried. She wasn't the type to cry from pain. But she felt something deeper, something beneath the skin. It was the feeling of being erased in a space she had worked her whole life to belong to. Her phone vibrated once. Then again. Then a third time. She finally looked. Messages from colleagues. Some asking if she was okay. Some offering vague apologies. Others pretending they didn't know what happened. But the one that made her pause was a message from the Deputy Director of Internal Affairs. Short. Formal. Requesting a meeting. Not offering support. Not acknowledging anything. Just bureaucracy dressed as concern. She stared at it for a long moment before standing up. Today wouldn't be about feelings. Today would be about facts. And she had all the power she needed to make the facts matter. By noon, she was at the Office of Civil Justice Reform Headquarters, a modest brick building tucked between two larger towers downtown. She passed by familiar faces, some nodding politely, others avoiding her gaze entirely. Inside the conference room, she requested all open complaints connected to Officer Croft. The system was slow, as usual. Designed that way. But after an hour, a stack of files sat in front of her like a quiet storm. Most marked as resolved. A few tagged as unsubstantiated. One was listed as pending further investigation, but dated 3 years back. Her eyes scanned the reports. Words like excessive force, verbal aggression, racial slurs, physical intimidation. Patterns as clear as day. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the documents heavy in her chest. These weren't just complaints. They were stories. People. Moments of humiliation buried under paper trails. And no one had connected the dots, because no one wanted to. But she did. She would. She started making calls. Quietly. Strategically. Reaching out to former complainants, to people in neighborhoods where Croft had patrolled, to officers who had served alongside him. Not all responded. Some were afraid. Some were angry. But a few were ready to speak. One of them, a retired black sergeant named Reuben, asked to meet in person. They met at a small diner just outside the city. Reuben was in his 60s, with tired eyes and calloused hands that held a coffee cup like it was keeping him grounded. He didn't say much at first. Just watched her, then finally said, "You remind me of someone I used to serve with." She didn't last long. Keisha asked what happened. Reuben didn't blink. The system chewed her up before she ever had a chance to bite back. Then he leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said something that sent a chill through her spine. Croft isn't new to this. He's just good at hiding it. But if you push, you'll find more than you're ready for. She pressed. Reuben told her about a case years ago, an undocumented teenager who died during a traffic stop. Croft had been one of the responding officers. The report said the boy had a seizure. But Reuben had seen the bruises. They made that file disappear, he said. Like it never happened. Keisha took notes. Her heart was pounding now, not from fear, but from the growing certainty that Croft's violence wasn't just tolerated, it was protected. Back at her office, she dug deeper. She requested archived surveillance footage from precincts, contacted journalists who had once tried to run stories but were shut down. The picture was becoming clearer. Croft wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom. And the courthouse incident had given her more than just moral ground, it had given her legal ground. But she couldn't move too fast. Not yet. She needed one more thing, undeniable proof. That week, she scheduled a follow-up observation at the same courtroom. This time, she made sure her presence was documented. Badge visible. Authorization in hand. No room for misunderstandings. Croft was there again, standing near the front with his usual scowl. When he saw her walk in, something in his face twitched. Confusion. Recognition. And then, discomfort. But he didn't move toward her. Not this time. She took her seat, unfolded her notepad, and didn't look away. Later that day, she requested access to the courthouse's security footage from the day of the incident. It wasn't easy. The clerk stalled. The sheriff's department gave excuses. Technical issues. Pending review. But she persisted. Finally, a young clerk, barely in his 20s, slipped her a thumb drive. No words. Just a nod. She watched the footage that night. Every second. Every angle. Her heart thudded as she saw herself on screen, sitting calmly, Croft approaching, the kick, her stumble. It was all there. Clear. Unedited. Unmistakable. She made copies. Now she had what she needed. But she knew better than to walk into battle alone. So she started building her team. Quietly. Carefully. Lawyers who had worked civil rights cases. Investigators with no ties to APD. Advocates who had spent years documenting abuses. She didn't tell them the whole plan. Just enough. Enough to make them believe that something big was coming, and that justice might finally be louder than silence. Croft, meanwhile, was starting to feel the shift. He noticed how officers spoke to him less. How meetings suddenly excluded him. One afternoon, he stormed into the supervisor's office, demanding answers. Why am I not on rotation for courthouse security anymore? The supervisor didn't meet his eyes. Just mumbled something about reassignment and left it at that. Croft's ego flared. He blamed politics. Claimed people were being too sensitive. But deep down, he knew something was coming. He just didn't know when, or from where. Meanwhile, Keisha prepared her report. Not just a file, but a presentation. Visual evidence. Historical data. Case comparisons. Witness statements. And at the center of it all, Officer Matthew Croft. Not just his actions, but the system that had allowed them. It would be presented to the governor's committee the following week. But before that, before the internal walls came crashing down, Keisha had one more stop to make. She visited the home of Jamal Turner, a young man who had filed a complaint against Croft 5 years earlier and had been arrested 3 months later under suspicious circumstances. His case had been dismissed, but not before he lost his job and his apartment. Keisha sat with him in his small living room, listened to him recount what happened, watched the pain in his eyes when he described being treated like nothing. She promised him something no one ever had before. You will be heard, she said. And he believed her. That night, she stood in her kitchen, staring at the wall clock, heart thudding steadily. Tomorrow would change everything. She could feel it. The air was thick with anticipation. The wheels were already turning. And when they hit that courtroom again, it wouldn't be her stumbling forward, it would be the system itself, dragged into the light it had tried so hard to avoid. She didn't know how Croft would react. But she knew he wasn't ready. And he had no idea who she really was. Not yet. But soon, he would. The day started like any other, with a sky smeared in dull gray and a drizzle that made the streets of Atlanta shimmer under the weight of tired morning traffic. But inside the Fulton County Courthouse, the air was different. Thicker. Tighter. Like something was about to snap. Keisha walked through the main entrance without hesitation, her heels sharp against the marble floor. Her expression calm, unreadable, but her mind already racing with the weight of what was about to happen. This was no longer about observation. This was execution. Every piece was in place. Every document signed. Every face that once turned away would now be forced to look directly at what they'd chosen to ignore. She passed officers in uniform, some gave nods of respect, others avoided her completely. It didn't matter anymore. They would all know soon. The courtroom was already filling by the time she stepped in, taking her seat near the front, not tucked away like last time, but in full view. Her presence was deliberate. She wasn't hiding anymore. At the judge's bench sat a stern-looking woman in her 50s, expression neutral but alert. The kind of person who'd seen too much to be shocked, but not enough to stop caring. This wasn't a trial, not in the traditional sense, it was a formal internal inquiry hearing, called at Keisha's request, under direct order of the governor's office. Closed session, but every seat was taken by someone who had reason to be there. Lawyers. Investigators. Community leaders. And Matthew Croft. He entered with the same posture as always, shoulders wide, face hardened, chin lifted as if nothing could touch him. But when his eyes met Keisha's across the room, something shifted. He didn't smirk. He didn't speak. He just stared, confused, calculating, trying to place her outside of the memory that had started this all. The kick. The silence. The aftermath. He hadn't seen her since, and in his mind, she was probably just another complaint lost in a pile of bureaucracy. But she wasn't. She was the pile. The judge cleared her throat, breaking the tension in the room. She introduced the hearing, citing misconduct allegations, previous reports reopened for re-evaluation, and the presentation of new evidence tied to Officer Croft's record. The room buzzed. Croft sat still, arms crossed, clearly annoyed. Then the judge nodded toward Keisha. "Ms. Simmons, you may begin your presentation." Keisha stood slowly, collected, then walked to the center of the room, facing the crowd, not just Croft. Her voice was steady but low, forcing everyone to lean in. She began not with the incident in the courtroom, but with names. Names of people who had filed complaints. Names of those who had been harmed. Names erased from official records, now spoken aloud again. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. Just facts. Then she pulled out the thumb drive and inserted it into the screen behind her. Footage flickered to life. The incident played in full, uncut, undeniable. Croft kicking her chair. Her stumbling forward. His words captured clearly on the courtroom mic. The silence that followed. No one moved. Keisha turned around slowly to face him. "That's what you did when you thought I was no one. When you assumed my silence meant weakness. When you believed that uniform made you untouchable." Croft didn't respond. His eyes shifted, jaw tight. He looked toward his attorney, but the man remained seated, stone-faced. Keisha continued. She moved on to the pattern of behavior, overlaying each complaint with timestamps, internal emails, and witness accounts. She showed disciplinary actions that were never enforced. Footage that contradicted official statements. One by one, the dots connected. Not just about him, but about the culture that protected him. Then she stepped away from the screen and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice thick with emotion but still under control, "for years, we've allowed the system to fail quietly. But failure isn't silent. It echoes. It leaves bruises. It destroys trust. And when someone like him abuses their power, it's not just the victims who suffer, it's the very foundation of justice that cracks." The judge remained expressionless, but her eyes blinked slower now. "Absorbing." Croft finally spoke, his voice sharp, defensive. "This is political. You're twisting old complaints that were already closed. If I was such a threat, why didn't anyone stop me before?" Keisha turned back toward him, holding his gaze now. "Because you were protected. Because the people who should have stopped you were too busy looking the other way. And because people like me weren't in the room yet. But I'm here now." He scoffed, shifting in his seat. "So this is revenge?" "No," she said, shaking her head slowly. This is accountability. The room was quiet. Heavy. Until the judge leaned forward and asked the question no one expected. Ms. Simmons, at what point were you assigned this investigation? Keisha didn't hesitate. The day after my appointment as Director of Civil Justice Reform. 3 days before the courtroom incident. A ripple moved through the room. Croft's eyes widened. His lips parted slightly, trying to process what he had just heard. You were appointed before that day? The judge asked again, for clarity. Keisha nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I entered that courtroom with full jurisdictional authority. I was there on official duty when I was assaulted by a member of the department I now oversee. Croft stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. You set me up. No, she said calmly. You exposed yourself. His lawyer tried to pull him back down, whispering something in his ear, but it was too late. Croft was unraveling, the mask slipping. He pointed at her, frustration overtaking restraint. This is what you people do. Twist the system. Turn it against the ones who keep order. Keisha stepped closer, stopping just short of him. Her voice didn't rise, but the gravity in her words made the room tilt. The system was already twisted. I'm just here to straighten it. Croft's breathing grew heavier. His hands clenched at his sides. The judge raised a hand, signaling for order. But no one looked away. Every eye in the room was fixed on the man who once believed he had nothing to answer for. And on the woman who had once been kicked like she didn't belong, now standing in control of every breath he took. The judge recessed the hearing, saying formal decisions would be delivered within 72 hours, pending final deliberation and legal review. But the truth was, the verdict had already arrived in that room. Not just legally. Spiritually. Morally. Keisha didn't need a gavel to know what had just happened. Croft, for the first time, understood what it felt like to be small. To be stripped of authority. To have someone look at you not with fear, but with judgment. And he didn't know how to carry that. As people began to leave, whispers rising into a low hum, Keisha stayed seated for a moment longer, her hands folded in her lap. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, release. Not because it was over. But because the reckoning had finally begun. And yet, this wasn't the end. Because the most shocking consequence still hadn't been revealed. And what Keisha was about to do next would leave even the governor speechless. As the room slowly emptied, a low murmur trailed behind the crowd like a wave of disbelief still crashing against the walls. Keisha remained seated, her fingers resting gently on the edge of the desk before her, as if still holding the weight of the moment in her palms. Her heart wasn't racing, she had trained herself long ago to keep her composure, but there was a pulse under her skin that hummed with something more than pride. It was the electricity of justice, real and raw, for once not abstract or postponed, but standing fully formed in the light of a reckoning no one could unsee. Croft was still there, sitting stiffly at the defense table, eyes locked on nothing, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. His attorney spoke to him in a low voice, urging calm, damage control, reputation management, but Croft wasn't listening. He was still trying to make sense of what had just happened, still stuck in the moment he realized she wasn't a problem, she was the system now. Keisha slowly rose from her seat, gathered her things, and made her way toward the exit, but just as she passed the defense table, Croft turned to her and muttered under his breath, "This was never about justice for you, this was personal." She stopped, not turning toward him immediately. She breathed in once through her nose, then looked down at him with an expression that wasn't anger, or even pity, it was clarity. Her voice was quiet, but cutting. Of course it's personal. It's personal every time someone like you decides my life matters less because of my skin. It's personal every time someone gets away with it. But what you don't understand is, it's not just my story anymore. It's bigger than both of us now. You just became the face of a sickness this system refuses to treat. So yes, it's personal. But not just for me. He opened his mouth, but no words came. There were none left. Not the kind that could save him. By the time she stepped out of the courthouse, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows over the stone steps. A few journalists were waiting at the bottom, microphones in hand, but Keisha walked past them without a word. She had already said what needed to be said where it counted most. She had barely reached her car when her phone buzzed. A message from the governor's office. "Call me immediately." She sat in the driver's seat and stared at the message for a long second before calling. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, but not without urgency. "Keisha," the governor said, "I watched the hearing. Your testimony was powerful. The footage, undeniable. But there's pressure. Croft's union is already threatening legal retaliation. The media is circling. We need to make sure we manage the response." Keisha let the words hang for a moment before answering. "With respect, Governor, this isn't about managing optics. This is about showing people what accountability actually looks like. We don't get to rewrite this moment to make it comfortable. We let it burn." There was silence on the line, then a sigh. "You're right," the governor said. "But there's one more thing. Croft's personnel files, there are sealed documents. From higher up. We need to talk in person." The call ended abruptly. She stared at her screen, unsettled now in a way she hadn't expected. She knew there were layers. She knew corruption rarely stopped at the bottom. But the idea that Croft's misconduct had been protected not just by silence, but by sealed files, by people in power, meant this wasn't just about a rogue officer. This was about something deeper. Something systemic. 2 days later, she sat across from the governor in his private office, files spread out across the desk. He looked exhausted. "These were sealed under direct order from a former deputy commissioner," he said, sliding a folder toward her. "Internal memos, suppressed reports, even video testimony from former officers. They all pointed to a pattern, but no one did anything. Croft wasn't just protected. He was used. Used to keep certain neighborhoods in check. Quiet. Intimidated." Keisha flipped through the documents, each page heavier than the last. "So he was a weapon," she said quietly. The governor nodded. "And they made sure no one could disarm him." She leaned back, closing the folder. "Until now." The next morning, Keisha called a press conference. She stood in front of a podium, cameras flashing, reporters leaning forward. Behind her stood members of her department, community leaders, and survivors of police abuse who had agreed to speak. The air buzzed with tension. She began with a simple sentence. "This is not a case of one bad cop. This is the exposure of a system that decided silence was safer than truth." She laid it all out. The footage. The suppressed files. The network of complicity that kept officers like Croft in positions of power while silencing the voices of those they harmed. She announced a full investigation into the command chain that protected him, the policies that allowed it, and the names of those responsible. Then, with a deep breath, she revealed what no one saw coming. "Effective immediately," she said, "we are launching a statewide audit of all sealed personnel files within law enforcement agencies. Every name. Every complaint. Every cover-up. No more shadows." The room erupted. Some in applause. Some in stunned silence. Croft, watching from his apartment, sank into his couch, the color draining from his face. He had been exposed. But now, he was being erased from the protection that once shielded him. His phone rang, and he didn't answer. His lawyer sent messages he ignored. For the first time, Croft felt what it meant to be seen not as a man in uniform, but as the threat he had become. And there was no badge big enough to hide behind now. Later that evening, Keisha stood in her office, staring out the window at the city lights. The battle wasn't over. The fight for justice never really ends. But today, something shifted. Something powerful. Not just for her, but for every person who had ever been silenced and told to sit down, shut up, and take it. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Jamal Turner. "Thank you for not letting them forget us." She smiled faintly, heart full. Because the truth wasn't just revealed. It was felt. And what came next was going to change everything. In the days following the press conference, Atlanta felt different. Not just in the headlines or on social media, but in the weight that hung in the air. Conversations shifted. Doors once closed began to creak open. Some people cheered loudly, celebrating what they saw as a long overdue reckoning. Others, more cautious, watched with skepticism, unsure if this wave of accountability was real or just another performative storm that would die down once the cameras were gone. For Keisha, the high of the moment was quickly tempered by the sheer volume of what came next. Whistleblowers began to come forward. Emails flooded her inbox. Former officers. Disillusioned detectives. Even a few current precinct captains, all with stories, with files, with receipts. Some had stayed quiet for years out of fear. Others had been buried under red tape and retaliation. But now, they were finally speaking. Not because they believed in the system, but because, for the first time in years, someone inside it made them believe it could still be held accountable. The files started to pile up. Patterns emerged, whole units operating without oversight, precincts where complaints were funneled into oblivion, officers rewarded with promotions after misconduct. The scope of the problem grew wider with every page, and Keisha realized something terrifying: Croft wasn't the climax of the rot, he was merely its beginning. He had been visible, violent, brazen. But others, the ones wearing suits instead of uniforms, the ones who signed the approvals and buried the investigations, they were harder to spot. And yet more dangerous. That realization began to weigh on her. Alone in her office, she reviewed testimonies late into the night, reading names of victims she hadn't heard before, seeing the shadows of their trauma written in phrases like, excessive force sustained, no charges filed, deceased on arrival. She thought about her own journey, how close she had come to never being in this position, how many times she had wanted to walk away from it all. And now, here she was, not just facing the truth, but standing at a crossroads. Because this wasn't just about Croft anymore. This was about confronting a deeper sickness, one that had roots high enough to threaten the very seat she now held. At the same time, pressure started to build from above. Politicians began to distance themselves. Some issued vague statements of support while quietly suggesting she slow down the investigation, make it less personal. Union leaders held press conferences accusing her of launching a witch hunt, claiming that morale among officers had plummeted. Anonymous threats began appearing in her inbox. A dead rat was left in front of her office one morning, its tail pinned to a note that read, "We remember faces." Security around her was tightened. Still, she refused to retreat. She knew backing down now wouldn't just mean failure, it would mean betrayal. Of every name on every complaint. Of every person who had stood beside her. Of herself. But it wasn't just external pressure that haunted her. Internally, she wrestled with doubt. In a quiet moment, seated across from her mother in the warmth of her childhood kitchen, Keisha let the mask drop for the first time in weeks. Vanessa, who had always carried her strength in her eyes, simply listened as her daughter spoke, not just about Croft or the files, but about the exhaustion that came from holding so much injustice alone. "I didn't expect to win," Keisha admitted, "I expected resistance. But I didn't think the cost would be this high." Vanessa reached over, held her hand, and said softly, "The cost was always high. You're just one of the few willing to pay it." Those words stayed with her. Gave her the clarity to keep going. Still, the dilemma deepened. Among the documents leaked to her team was one that implicated a current deputy chief, someone the governor had recently appointed to lead a new law enforcement reform board. The file contained direct evidence that he had suppressed internal investigations and altered complaint outcomes for years, including cases tied to Croft and others like him. If Keisha exposed him, it would shake the State House. It would force the governor into public confrontation. It would fracture fragile alliances and could stall broader reforms. But if she didn't, if she let it slide to preserve momentum, she would become part of the same silence she had sworn to fight. She met with the governor in private. The room was cold. Formal. The kind of silence that carried unspoken expectations. She laid out the file in front of him. Watched his face harden as he read. Then, quietly, she said, "This isn't a political decision. This is a moral one." He didn't look up at first. Just stared at the evidence. Then finally asked, "Do you understand what this could do to everything we've built in the last few weeks?" Keisha didn't blink. "If it's built on lies, it needs to come down." The governor stood, walked to the window, hands in his pockets. For a moment, she thought he might argue. But instead, he exhaled slowly and said, "Do what you have to do. But be ready. Once you open that door, you don't get to close it." Keisha nodded, not because she felt brave, but because she was done being afraid. She moved forward with the release. At the press briefing the following week, she stood before a wall of reporters and delivered the most difficult part of the truth. She named the deputy chief. She outlined the evidence. She called for an immediate independent review of the reform board and requested that the governor appoint an external oversight committee to monitor future investigations. The fallout was instant. Headlines exploded. Political allies fled. Some called her a hero. Others called her a traitor. But what mattered most was that victims finally saw someone willing to risk everything to make the truth known. Croft, now awaiting a final ruling on his termination and facing multiple civil suits, watched from a hotel room. His world had collapsed. Friends stopped answering calls. His union distanced itself. His wife filed for separation. He gave a single interview to a fringe news outlet, blaming the culture of fear created by reformists and accusing Keisha of targeting him for personal reasons. But the public didn't buy it. The truth had too much weight now. The footage. The documents. The pain in the voices of those who came forward. It was undeniable. But Keisha knew something deeper: vindication wasn't the same as peace. Every night, she still lay awake with the faces of those she couldn't help. The complaints that came too late. The families whose wounds wouldn't be healed by policy change. She wasn't naive enough to believe one investigation would fix decades of systemic harm. But she believed in moments. And this was a moment that had cracked the facade wide open. And yet, just as the dust seemed to settle, she received an anonymous envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph. A young black man, beaten, unconscious, handcuffed. No name. No case number. Just a date. 10 years ago. The message was clear. There were still ghosts waiting to be seen. And the battle was far from over. Keisha sat at her desk late that night, the envelope still open beside her, the photograph spread out in front of her like a wound. The image refused to release its grip on her mind. The boy's face was barely visible beneath the bruises, but his hands, cuffed and limp, spoke louder than any official report ever could. She traced the edges of the photo with her eyes, absorbing every detail, every shadow, searching for clues. The date scrawled on the back in faded ink was precise: April 19, 2013. No name. No location. No context. Just evidence without a file, pain without a voice. It was a message, but it wasn't just about the boy. It was about her. Someone wanted her to know there were still bodies buried in the silence, still stories that had never been told. And if she stopped now, if she let the momentum fade, this boy would remain what he had become, a warning instead of a witness. The next morning, Keisha gathered her team in the small conference room at the Civil Justice Office, the mood unusually quiet. She placed the photo on the table, letting everyone see it, watching their expressions change from curiosity to tension as the image settled into the room. One of the investigators, a woman named Lisa, leaned in closely. "Where did this come from?" Keisha didn't answer right away. Then she looked up and said, "Someone wants us to keep going. Or maybe, they want to see if we're brave enough to." A moment passed, and then a voice from the corner spoke up. It was Malik, her lead researcher, eyes sharp and steady. "Then let's find out who he is. Let's finish what we started." They began digging. Every hospital admission on that date. Every police dispatch in the metro area. Every call logged under excessive force or injury during arrest. It took hours, then days. Dead ends, missing files, sealed records. But then Lisa found something, a handwritten intake note at a county hospital dated that same night, describing a young black male with extensive injuries. No name. Registered as a John Doe. He had never regained consciousness. Transferred to a long-term care facility 2 weeks later. Still alive. Keisha felt her breath catch. She stared at the screen, stunned. This boy, this man now, was still out there. Living. Forgotten. She felt a rush of purpose swell in her chest, the kind that made her stand straighter, speak clearer. She turned to her team. "We're not letting him stay nameless. We find him. We bring his story back." The facility was outside the city limits, quiet and clinical, the kind of place where people were sent when the system didn't know what else to do with them. Keisha walked the halls with a nurse guiding her, clipboard in hand, expression guarded. When they reached his room, the nurse paused before opening the door. "He doesn't talk. He hasn't responded to anyone in years. Most of the staff doesn't even know his full name. We just call him 1432. That's the number on his chart." Keisha nodded and stepped inside. The room was small. Sterile. A single bed with white sheets. Machines quietly monitoring vitals. And there he was, alive, but still held captive by whatever had happened that night over a decade ago. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. His eyes were open, unfocused, staring past her. She reached out gently, touching his hand. "I don't know your name," she whispered, "but I know what they did to you. And I swear to you, we're not going to let you be invisible anymore." She stayed for nearly an hour, talking to him softly, telling him about the hearings, about Croft, about everything they'd uncovered. She didn't expect a response. But before she left, something happened. His eyes shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. It wasn't a miracle recovery. But it was something. A flicker. And for Keisha, that flicker was enough to burn down every excuse not to fight harder. Back in the office, she pushed her team to trace the chain of custody, who had brought him in, which officers had logged the report, who had sealed the file. It didn't take long to find the link. One name. Again. Croft. Her hands tightened into fists when she saw it. Not just because of what it meant, but because of what it confirmed. He had been doing this for years. And no one had stopped him. No one had cared. Until now. She called the DA personally. Requested the case be reopened. Asked for a formal criminal investigation, not just into Croft, but into the officers who helped him cover it up, the supervisors who approved the transfers, the bureaucrats who erased the files. The DA, a middle-aged white man who had once hesitated to support her reforms, sat silent on the other end of the line before finally saying, "You understand what this means, right? You're reopening wounds this city buried a long time ago." Keisha didn't flinch. They were never buried. Just ignored. With legal proceedings now expanding beyond administrative hearings into criminal territory, the atmosphere shifted again. Media outlets doubled down. Civil rights groups began organizing vigils for victims whose cases had been buried. People who had once felt voiceless began calling her office, some just to say thank you. Others to finally tell their story. Keisha felt the momentum rising again, but this time, it wasn't centered around her. It was about the people. About reclaiming what had been taken. And yet, as the movement swelled, so did the risks. Croft's lawyer requested a private meeting with Keisha's legal team. She agreed. The man came in smug, but cautious. He placed a single document on the table and pushed it toward her. My client's willing to cooperate. Full confession. In exchange for immunity from jail time. Keisha didn't even glance at the paper. She leaned forward, eyes sharp. He wants to walk after ruining lives. The lawyer shrugged. He's offering names. Names that go far beyond anything you've seen. You want to clean the whole house, not just one room. This is how you do it. She paused, then picked up the document and skimmed it. Croft was willing to expose not just fellow officers, but city officials, prosecutors, even judges. The system wasn't just broken. It had been functioning this way by design. She stood up, document still in hand. Tell him if he wants to talk, he'll do it on record. No back rooms. No sealed testimonies. He tells the truth, all of it, in front of the people who deserve to hear it. The lawyer hesitated. That's not how these things are usually done. Keisha stepped closer, voice low and firm. That's the point. We're not doing things the usual way anymore. Later that week, Croft appeared at a closed-door deposition, recorded and attended by legal observers, victim advocates, and representatives from the Department of Justice. For 6 hours, he named names. Admitted to beatings. Described cover-ups. Laughed, once, when recalling how easy it had been to manipulate internal reviews. By the end, the room was still and cold, filled with the horror of hearing corruption described so casually. Keisha watched without expression, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. When it ended, she walked over to him. He was being unshackled, preparing to leave under supervised custody. She stopped just inches from him, looked him straight in the eyes, and said, "You thought the worst thing that could happen to you was losing your badge. But now, you have to live in a world where everyone sees you for who you really are." He stared back, and for the first time, his face cracked. No words. Just silence. And for Keisha, that silence meant everything. Because now, it wasn't her silence that echoed in courtrooms. It was his. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Keisha had ever lived through. Headlines dominated the media day after day, calling it the most explosive exposure of systemic abuse in Atlanta's law enforcement history. Civil lawsuits piled up against the city. Public protests doubled in size. The DOJ launched a formal investigation into multiple agencies. And Croft's testimony, streamed publicly by court order, shook the entire community to its core. It wasn't just the brutality that stunned people. It was the structure behind it. The way his actions had been allowed, overlooked, even encouraged. The casual way he described the suppression of evidence, the falsification of reports, the way he spoke names of former colleagues and supervisors like it was nothing. People expected to see a monster behind that badge, but what they saw was worse, a man so ordinary, so convinced of his own righteousness, that he believed he'd never be held accountable. That belief had protected him for 15 years. Until now. And yet, for Keisha, the weight of the truth didn't feel like victory. It felt like a flood she couldn't stop. Every day, more people came forward. A mother whose teenage son had died in custody. A public defender who had quit in silence after being threatened by officers. A retired detective who confessed to destroying evidence under pressure. Each story chipped away at her, not because she was surprised, but because of how unsurprising it all was. She spent her days listening, cataloging, building cases. But at night, alone in her apartment, the silence returned. Sometimes she'd wake up at 3 a.m., heart racing, images in her head of victims she'd never met. She began carrying a small notebook in her purse, scribbling thoughts, names, patterns. It wasn't about tracking progress, it was about holding on to something real. Something human. Then came the day she returned to the care facility. The young man, still unnamed, remained unresponsive, his condition unchanged. But she came anyway. She sat by his bedside and read aloud the updates, the hearings, the arrests, the policies that had begun to shift. His name still eluded them, but her team had narrowed it down to a few possibilities. One of them, a boy reported missing in 2013 named Isaiah Coleman, matched the timeline and approximate age. The family had moved states shortly after the disappearance, believing he'd run away. Keisha had reached out to them quietly. A DNA test was in progress. That morning, she held the results in her hand. She walked into his room, held his hand, and said softly, "Isaiah. I think that's your name. I know you can't speak, but I want you to know, we found you. We're going to tell your story. And I'm not going to stop until the world knows what they did to you." She stayed with him for hours. A nurse brought her tea. At one point, she fell asleep in the chair beside him, exhaustion finally catching up with her. She dreamed of a courtroom filled with people whose faces blurred into one. She stood in front of them, holding a folder that burned in her hands. When she opened it, it was blank. Just pages and pages of silence. She woke up with a sharp inhale, eyes burning, hands still gripping his. Later that week, she met with the governor again. The air between them was heavier now. He looked older than he had before, worn down by pressure, political backlash, and the enormity of what had been unleashed. He asked her plainly, "How far are you willing to go with this?" She looked him in the eye and said, "All the way. Even if it costs me everything." He nodded slowly. It might. She knew it. And still, she didn't back down. Her name was now being mentioned as a possible federal appointee. Civil rights groups had begun to rally behind her nationally. Her face was on magazine covers. Invitations for interviews flooded in. But she turned them all down. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. She wanted change. Concrete, irreversible change. Not just at the surface, but deep in the marrow of the system. At the same time, her investigation had reached a boiling point. Files linked to the former deputy commissioner were now under review by a federal oversight committee. Keisha received a tip from a former city employee, an internal memo from years ago that indicated Croft had been part of a clandestine unit unofficially designed to apply pressure in high-crime neighborhoods, particularly those predominantly black. The program had no name. No official existence. But its instructions had been clear. It was another piece of the puzzle that explained everything, and it implicated people far beyond what anyone had imagined. She held a closed meeting with the Oversight Committee. She laid out the findings. Showed them the memo. The video depositions. The internal messages. Names. Signatures. Patterns. When she finished, the room was silent. One of the members, a former judge, leaned forward and said, "This is a coordinated abuse of power on a scale we've never formally acknowledged." Keisha didn't blink. Now we have to. Outside the committee chambers, reporters waited. The public was hungry for answers. But Keisha had learned that timing mattered. Strategy mattered. The right truth told too soon could be drowned out by noise. She needed the moment to be undeniable. And so she planned a final public hearing, a live-streamed session that would present the full breadth of the corruption uncovered, from Croft's violence to the systemic machinery that enabled it. The night before the hearing, Keisha sat alone in her apartment, staring at a wall of photos pinned above her desk. Victims. Families. Protest images. Newspaper headlines. In the center, a picture of Isaiah, finally confirmed through DNA to be Isaiah Coleman. His family had visited him. His mother had cried in his lap, whispering prayers into his ear. Keisha had watched from the hallway, unable to speak, just holding back tears as the years of grief poured out in one impossible moment. Isaiah had blinked, once, when his mother touched his cheek. A single blink that changed everything. That image, Isaiah, his mother beside him, was what Keisha carried into the hearing the next morning. She stepped onto the stage in front of a national audience, not with fire in her voice, but with unwavering clarity. She laid out the findings piece by piece. Named names. Detailed programs. Shared testimonies. And then, she told Isaiah's story. She showed his photo. Described the night he was found. The injuries. The erasure. And how it had taken over a decade for him to be seen again. She ended with a pause. Then spoke the final words slowly. What happened to Isaiah wasn't a mistake. It was the result of a system that valued power over humanity. We owe it to him, to all of them, not just to feel outrage, but to act. To change this system at its roots. And we're just getting started. The room erupted. Applause. Tears. News anchors struggling to keep composure. Across the country, viewers watched the story unfold in real time. It wasn't just about Atlanta anymore. It was about every city, every department, every silent file tucked into a drawer. After the hearing, Keisha stepped outside, alone for a moment, breathing in the cool air like it was the first breath she'd taken in weeks. Lisa joined her, handing her a folder. You need to see this. It's another envelope. No return address. Just arrived this morning. Keisha opened it. Inside, a single sentence, typed neatly on a piece of paper, there are more like Isaiah. She closed the folder slowly. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in resolve. Because now, more than ever, she understood exactly what was at stake. And she wasn't done. Not even close. 6 months later, Atlanta was not the same city. It still pulsed with its usual rhythm, traffic congestion, busy courtrooms, city council debates, but beneath the familiar noise, something had changed. Policy reforms that had once seemed impossible were now in motion. Oversight boards gained legal power. Entire departments were restructured. Multiple officers implicated by Croft's testimony were terminated, and some arrested. Investigations were reopened, settlements were awarded, and victims, many of whom had waited years in silence, finally saw their truths acknowledged. It wasn't a perfect ending. Some cases stalled. Some names never made it into courtrooms. But for the first time in decades, accountability felt real. Tangible. And that shift, though quiet, echoed louder than any protest ever could. Matthew Croft, stripped of his badge and status, now lived in a remote rural town under protection. The immunity deal had saved him from prison, but not from consequences. His face was etched into the public consciousness, not as a hero, but as the symbol of a broken system. He couldn't walk into a store without stares. Couldn't apply for jobs without rejection. His name triggered disgust online and in person. Eventually, even the last of his allies faded away. Alone, disgraced, and powerless, he faded into irrelevance, the ultimate punishment for a man who had once lived to be feared. In the end, no amount of legal immunity could shield him from social justice. He had been seen for what he was, and nothing could unsee that. Isaiah Coleman was no longer John Doe 1432. With the support of medical professionals, family, and community resources, his condition gradually improved. He never regained full speech, but he began responding to touch, recognizing faces, following voices with his eyes. His mother, a woman of unbreakable strength, moved back to Atlanta to be with him every day. Their story inspired a national fund for victims of police brutality who suffered long-term injuries. They weren't statistics anymore, they were people with names, histories, and futures. Isaiah became a symbol of survival, and his existence stood as a living testament to everything that had been hidden, now brought to light. And even though he couldn't speak the words, his presence said everything that needed to be heard. For Keisha, the weight of it all settled into her body slowly. The hearings. The documents. The threats. The faces. It was a burden few could carry without breaking. But she had made it through, not untouched, but unbroken. When the president appointed her to lead a new national task force on law enforcement reform, the announcement was met with both praise and protest. She accepted it not for power, but for reach. From her new position, she helped shape legislation that created national standards for transparency, accountability, and citizen protections. Her name became synonymous with courage, precision, and change. But Keisha remained grounded. She declined every television deal, every book offer, every attempt to turn her into a celebrity. "This isn't about me," she told a young reporter once, "it's about making sure that what happened never becomes normal again." Despite the high-profile work, she never stopped visiting Isaiah. Once a month, she'd sit by his window and talk about everything happening in the world. Some visits were silent. Some were filled with tears. But always, there was presence. There was acknowledgement. There was healing. On the anniversary of the day she received his photo, she brought him a framed picture of his mother holding his hand in the hospital. On the back, she wrote one sentence: "You were never invisible." That gesture resonated far beyond the walls of his room. Across the country, communities adopted the same words as rallying cries. Murals painted in cities like Detroit, Baltimore, and Oakland echoed the same phrase. "You were never invisible." Keisha hadn't just exposed a system, she had redefined how justice could be seen, felt, and pursued. There were moments, of course, when she questioned if it had been worth it. Moments when exhaustion crept in, when resistance pushed back harder, when change felt too slow. But then she'd receive a letter from someone she'd never met, a survivor, a mother, a former officer, thanking her for not giving up. And in those letters, she found reminders that every name she spoke, every silence she broke, had carved a path for someone else to stand in the light. Now, I want you to take a moment. Think about what you've just heard. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was about reckoning. It was about a woman who turned silence into a weapon for truth. A boy who lived to become a movement. A corrupt officer brought to his knees not by violence, but by the power of exposure. This was about justice, the kind that doesn't come easy, the kind that demands more than outrage. The kind that needs time, courage, and relentless clarity. How many stories like Isaiah's go untold? How many systems still function on the silence of their victims? And more importantly, how many Keishas are out there, waiting for the world to listen, waiting for the chance to break the cycle? If this story moved you, I want to hear your thoughts. What part of this story hit you the hardest? What did you feel when justice finally caught up to injustice? Share your reflections in the comments. Let your voice be part of this ongoing conversation. Because justice doesn't end with one story, it begins with how we carry it forward. And if you want to keep hearing powerful, real, and deeply human stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button. Share this video. Let's make sure these stories never stay in the dark again. We'll see you in the next story.